The Mafia boss's son was causing chaos in the mansion until the Black Maid calmed him with one touch. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. The grand mansion stood at the edge of the city, its marble columns towering above the streets below. Inside, the quiet elegance of the estate was always a stark contrast to the chaos that sometimes erupted within its walls. Today, however, the mansion was anything but calm. The young son of the Mafia boss, Alexio, was throwing a tantrum that echoed through the hallways. His voice, filled with rage and frustration, filled every corner of the mansion. It was unlike anything anyone had seen before. Alexio was no longer the charming child that everyone adored. He had become unpredictable, a force of destruction, and no one seemed to know how to calm him down. He wasn't just breaking things, he was breaking people. The security staff had tried to step in, but they were met with anger and violence. His father, the Mafia boss, was too busy to intervene, his mind consumed by the business dealings that kept him at the top. No one dared to approach Alexio, the heir to a criminal empire, in his fit of rage. But there was one person who still had the courage to try. The Black Maid, Naomi, had worked in the mansion for several years. She had seen Alexio grow from a child to a teenager, and though he had always been a handful, he had never been this dangerous. Naomi wasn't just another servant. She was the heart of the mansion's staff, the one everyone trusted. She had a way with people, especially those in pain, and she knew that Alexio's anger wasn't just a sign of misbehavior. There was something deeper, something he couldn't express, and she knew that if anyone could reach him, it would be her. As she approached the hallway where Alexio's rage was building, Naomi took a deep breath. The sound of his screams grew louder as she got closer, but she didn't hesitate. Her footsteps were steady, and her resolve was unshakable. When she rounded the corner, she saw him. Alexio was throwing a vase across the room, his eyes wild with anger. The staff had scattered, too afraid to intervene. But Naomi stood tall, her presence a quiet authority that seemed to command the room. Alexio, she called softly, her voice calm and steady. He froze for a moment, his anger shifting to confusion as he turned to face her. The room fell silent, and Naomi took a slow step forward, her eyes meeting his. "You don't have to do this," she said gently. "Whatever is making you hurt, it doesn't have to control you." For a moment, Alexio stared at her, his expression hard, like a wall he had built around himself. But Naomi didn't back down. She took another step, her hand reaching out. "You're not alone, Alexio. I'm here for you." His eyes flickered with something. Uncertainty, vulnerability, before he let out a shaky breath. Naomi's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a simple touch, but one that seemed to ground him in the moment. The anger in his eyes began to fade, replaced by something softer, more confused. Naomi didn't say anything else. She simply stood there, letting her presence do the work. And slowly, as if the walls around him were crumbling, Alexio's rage faded completely. His shoulders slumped, and he exhaled deeply, as if a weight had been lifted from him. Naomi had done it. With just one touch, she had calmed the storm inside him. For the first time in a long time, Alexio felt like he could breathe again. He didn't know what had changed, but he knew one thing. Naomi had reached him when no one else could. The moment was quiet, peaceful even, as Naomi gently guided him to a nearby chair, sitting down beside him. No words were needed. In that one moment, the chaos had been silenced, and the tension in the mansion melted away. The silence in the room hung heavy after Naomi's touch had calmed Alexio. He sat there, eyes focused on the floor, as though the anger and chaos that had consumed him only moments ago had completely drained from his body. Naomi remained beside him, her hand still resting gently on his shoulder, offering a quiet reassurance that spoke louder than words. She didn't move, didn't push him to speak, knowing that sometimes the most healing thing was simply being present. Slowly, the tension in his posture softened, and he let out a deep, shaky breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alexio wasn't fighting against something inside of him. He felt, perhaps for the first time, a flicker of peace. Naomi had known from the start that the anger wasn't just about the shattered vase or the broken things around him. There was something deeper, something that could only be fixed with patience, empathy, and the willingness to simply be there for him. As the seconds stretched into minutes, Naomi didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The calming presence she offered was enough. Finally, Alexio raised his head, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since his outburst. For a brief moment, she saw a vulnerability in them, a recognition of the fact that someone had reached him, even when no one else could. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried a weight of emotion he had been holding in for far too long. "I don't know what's wrong with me," Alexio confessed, his eyes tracing the floor as though ashamed of his actions. Naomi's expression remained calm, her voice soft but firm as she responded. "There's nothing wrong with you, Alexio. Sometimes, the world just gets too loud, too much. And it's okay to feel like you can't control it. What matters is that you're here now, and we'll figure it out, one step at a time." His eyes flickered up to meet hers again, searching her face for any hint of judgment. But there was none. Just understanding, a quiet promise that she wouldn't leave him to struggle on his own. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't want to be like them." Naomi knew exactly what he meant. She knew the pressure he faced every day, the expectation to be ruthless, to take after his father. But in that moment, as she looked into the eyes of a young man torn between the man he was expected to become and the one he truly was, Naomi made a silent vow to help him find his way. "You don't have to be like them," she said gently, her voice steady. "You have a choice, Alexio. You don't have to live by their rules." There was a long pause, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the mansion's air conditioning, the quiet hum of the world moving on outside. Alexio's breathing slowed, the anger that had overtaken him now a distant memory. He looked at Naomi, a sense of something new in his gaze. "Thank you," he said quietly. Naomi nodded, her hand still on his shoulder, offering a quiet smile. "You don't need to thank me," she replied softly. "You just need to remember, you're not alone." The weight of those words hung between them, a simple but profound reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was someone who cared enough to listen, to offer comfort without judgment. Naomi stood then, her hand still resting on his shoulder for a moment longer before she withdrew it gently. "You should rest," she suggested, her tone now a little more playful, easing the tension in the room. "I'll make sure everything's in order here." Alexio nodded, though he didn't get up immediately. He remained seated for a moment longer, his mind turning over what Naomi had said. He had a long way to go, and the journey wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than what the world expected of him. As Naomi left the room, she cast one last look back at him. His eyes followed her, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Not the kind of smile that came with arrogance or anger, but a real smile, one that held promise. Naomi closed the door behind her, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She had done what she came to do, but she knew this was just the beginning. The mansion was quiet now, the storm inside Alexio calmed, but the echoes of it still lingered in the air. She knew that it wasn't just about one moment of peace. It was about creating a space where Alexio could truly feel like he had a chance to change. And that, she knew, would take time. But she was willing to give it. Naomi had always believed that the greatest act of kindness was offering someone the chance to heal, even when they didn't believe it was possible. And as she moved down the hall, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe, just maybe, she could help him become the man he was meant to be. The days following Naomi's intervention were quieter in the mansion, but the calm was a fragile one. Alexio had taken Naomi's words to heart, and although the anger that had once consumed him was now contained, there was still a sense of unease that lingered in the air. Naomi continued her daily routines, but she couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in Alexio. There was a kind of distance in the way he now walked through the halls, as if the weight of his position was starting to weigh heavier on him. Every morning, she would see him standing by the grand windows of the mansion, his gaze lost in the distance, as though searching for something he couldn't find. Naomi wasn't sure what it was that Alexio needed, but she knew one thing. He was no longer the reckless young man who acted without thought. There was a quieter, more introspective version of him emerging, one that didn't seem to have a place in the world of power and violence he had been born into. One afternoon, Naomi found herself passing by the study when she heard the sound of books being shuffled. The door was slightly ajar, and when she peered inside, she saw Alexio sitting at the desk, his brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages of a book. It was a rare sight to see him like this, in such a peaceful moment, not consumed by anger or fear. Naomi knocked lightly on the doorframe, and Alexio looked up, surprised to see her. "Naomi," he said softly, closing the book and sitting back in his chair. "I didn't expect to see you here." Naomi stepped inside, offering him a small smile. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Alexio nodded, though there was something in his eyes that suggested he was still far from fine. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice quiet. "About everything. About the way I've been living my life. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Naomi's heart ached for him. She knew the burden that came with being born into power, especially when that power was built on a foundation of violence and fear. "It's not easy, Alexio," she said, her voice gentle. "But you have the power to change. You don't have to follow the path that's been laid out for you." Alexio sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know what to do. I've been told my whole life that this is who I am supposed to be. My father expects me to follow in his footsteps. But every time I try, it feels like I'm losing myself." Naomi moved closer, sitting down beside him. "You are more than what your father wants you to be," she said softly. "You don't have to let his expectations define you. It's not easy, but you have the strength to create your own future." Alexio looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if looking for the truth in her words. "Do you really think I can change?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Naomi smiled warmly. "I believe you can. I've seen you in a different light, Alexio. I've seen the person beneath all the anger and the pressure. You have a good heart, and that's what matters." Alexio remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him. Naomi watched him, unsure of what he was thinking, but knowing that this moment could be a turning point for him. Finally, Alexio spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "What if I don't know who I am anymore?" he asked, almost to himself. Naomi reached out, placing a hand gently on his. "It's okay to not have all the answers," she said. "The important thing is that you're asking the right questions. And you're not alone in this. You don't have to do it all by yourself." There was a long silence between them, and in that moment, Naomi knew that Alexio's journey wasn't going to be easy. But she also knew that this was the beginning of something new for him, a chance to redefine who he was and who he wanted to be. The next few weeks were filled with subtle changes in Alexio. He spent more time in the study, reading books on philosophy, history, and even art, things that once seemed so distant from the world he had known. Naomi would often catch him deep in thought, his eyes fixed on the pages of a book, and she could see that the walls he had built around himself were slowly beginning to crumble. But the real turning point came one evening when Alexio asked Naomi to meet him in the garden. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns, and the air was warm with the promise of change. When Naomi arrived, Alexio was standing by the fountain, his hands in his pockets. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and for the first time in a long while, there was a softness in his eyes. "Naomi," he said, his voice steady, "I've been thinking. I want to make things right. I want to do better, not just for myself, but for everyone around me." Naomi's heart swelled with hope as she approached him. "I'm proud of you, Alexio," she said softly. "You're on the right path." As the two of them stood together in the fading light, Naomi realized that no matter how long it took, Alexio had started to take the first steps toward healing. And while the road ahead would be long and uncertain, Naomi knew that he was no longer alone. She would be there every step of the way, helping him find the person he was meant to be. The days that followed brought an undeniable sense of change to the mansion. The silence that had once been filled with tension and chaos now felt more like a quiet acceptance, though the air still buzzed with the unspoken weight of everything that had transpired. Alexio's transformation, though subtle, was evident. Naomi noticed the way he interacted with the staff, the way his shoulders no longer carried the heavy burden of anger. He was still the son of a Mafia boss, still entrenched in a world of power and danger, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He no longer sought to dominate or destroy, but to understand. Each morning, he could be found in the garden, a book in his hands, lost in the pages of philosophy or history. His once chaotic energy had found a new focus. Naomi would pass by the garden often, offering a small nod or a smile as she went about her duties. She had seen him grow in ways no one had expected, and it filled her with hope. But there were still moments when Alexio's past would come rushing back, like waves crashing against the shore. One of those moments came late one evening when he asked her to join him in the study. The mansion, though grand and beautiful, often felt cold, with its high ceilings and marble floors that echoed with every step. The study, however, was different. It was a place where Alexio had begun to retreat, a place where he could be himself, away from the demands of his family and their empire. Naomi walked in, her steps light, but her heart heavy with the uncertainty that always followed Alexio's request for her company. She found him sitting at the large wooden desk, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The pages of a book were spread out in front of him, but his eyes were focused elsewhere, deep in thought. "Naomi," Alexio said as she entered, his voice filled with a quiet seriousness she hadn't heard in some time. "I need to talk to you." Naomi nodded, walking over to the chair opposite him and sitting down. "Of course, Alexio. What's on your mind?" He exhaled slowly, his hands running through his dark hair as he gathered his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his gaze shifting from the book in front of him to meet her eyes. "About making a change, about choosing my own path. And I'm not sure if I'm ready." Naomi leaned forward, her expression soft but understanding. "It's not about being ready, Alexio. It's about starting. The first step is always the hardest, but it's the only way to move forward." Alexio shook his head, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I know that. But what if I can't change? What if I'm too far gone?" Naomi's heart ached for him. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the fear that gripped him whenever he thought about leaving behind the life that had been thrust upon him. "No one is too far gone," she said gently. "You have more power than you realize, Alexio. You've already taken the first step by acknowledging that you want to change. That's more than most people ever do." There was a long silence between them, and Naomi could see the conflict in Alexio's eyes. He was torn between the man he wanted to be and the man he had been trained to become. The pressure of his family's legacy, the weight of their expectations, seemed to crush him in ways that Naomi could only begin to understand. "I don't know how to do this," Alexio finally admitted, his voice low and raw. "I don't know how to let go of everything I've known." Naomi reached across the desk, placing her hand gently on his. "You don't have to let go all at once. You just have to take it one day at a time. And you don't have to do it alone." Alexio looked at her, his eyes softening with something that resembled hope. "But what if I fail?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi gave him a reassuring smile. "Then we try again. Failure is just part of the journey, Alexio. It doesn't define you." For the first time in a long while, Alexio allowed himself to believe her. He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the desk, and for a moment, there was peace between them. Naomi had offered him a lifeline, a chance to move forward, and in that moment, Alexio realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. He didn't have to carry the weight of his past by himself. The world outside the study felt far away, as though time had slowed down. The mansion, with all its wealth and power, seemed insignificant compared to the quiet connection that had formed between them. As the night stretched on, Naomi stood to leave, but before she did, Alexio looked up at her once more. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for believing in me." Naomi smiled, her heart full. "It's not about believing in you, Alexio. It's about you believing in yourself." With that, she left the study, the door clicking softly behind her. As she walked down the hallway, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. Alexio still had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time, it seemed like he was on the right path. She didn't know what the future held for him, but she knew that he had the strength to face whatever came his way. And for that, she was grateful. As the days went by, Alexio's transformation began to take shape more clearly. The storm that had once raged inside him now felt like a distant memory. It was as if the whirlwind of anger had been replaced by a quiet calm, a calm that seemed to fill every corner of the mansion. Yet, despite this newfound peace, Naomi could see that Alexio was still wrestling with his place in the world. He was no longer the reckless son of a mafia boss, but he wasn't entirely free either. There was a lingering uncertainty in his eyes whenever he passed by the grand mirrors or the portraits of his ancestors that lined the walls of the mansion. He still had questions, still struggled with the weight of his heritage, and Naomi knew the path forward wasn't going to be easy. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Alexio asked Naomi to meet him by the fountain in the garden again. The light was soft, the golden hues of dusk reflecting off the water as if the whole world was holding its breath. Naomi found him standing by the edge, his hands in his pockets, staring out over the garden. The quiet in the air seemed to mirror the stillness in him, and she approached slowly, not wanting to disturb his thoughts. When Alexio turned to face her, he seemed different, more introspective than she had seen him in a long time. "Naomi," he began, his voice carrying a seriousness that caught her attention. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about being more than just what my father wants me to be." Naomi stepped closer, her gaze steady and encouraging. "And what have you decided?" she asked, her voice soft, yet full of curiosity. Alexio let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, the uncertainty still heavy in his tone. "I want to change. I want to find my own way. But there are days when I still feel like I'm just pretending, like I don't really know who I am." Naomi paused for a moment, watching him closely. She could sense the depth of his internal struggle, the conflict between the man he was raised to be and the man he was beginning to want to become. "It's okay to feel like that," she said gently, stepping closer to him. "The road to finding yourself isn't always clear, but you're taking the first steps, and that's what matters. You're already stronger than you think." Alexio looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "I don't want to disappoint anyone, Naomi. Not my father, not the family. But sometimes, I feel like I'm trapped in this life that I didn't choose. I don't know how to get out of it." Naomi's heart ached for him. She had always known the power and the pressure that came with being born into such a world. But she also knew that Alexio wasn't helpless. He had the strength to carve out a life for himself if he chose to. "You don't have to get out of it, Alexio," she said quietly. "You just have to take back control. You can still be a part of your family, but you don't have to be controlled by them." There was a long pause as Alexio absorbed her words. His eyes wandered over the garden, the peaceful setting offering a stark contrast to the turmoil he felt inside. For a moment, Naomi could see the battle raging within him. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders relaxed. "Maybe I've been looking at this all wrong," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe it's not about running away from my family. Maybe it's about finding a way to stay true to myself, even in this world I've been born into." Naomi smiled, her heart lifting at the sight of him taking a step toward his own freedom. "Exactly," she said softly. "You can still be yourself, Alexio. You don't have to become someone else to find peace." Alexio turned to face her, his eyes now filled with something else, determination. "I don't know where this road will take me, but I'm ready to try," he said, his voice steady. Naomi nodded, her expression filled with pride. "I'll be here to help you, every step of the way." As they stood together in the garden, the evening air now cooling, Alexio felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him for so long. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer felt like he was walking it alone. With Naomi by his side, he knew he had a chance to build a life that was his own, one step at a time. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that change was not only possible, but within his reach. The mansion, with all its grandness and shadows, no longer felt like a prison. It was simply a place, and he was free to shape his future however he saw fit. As Naomi turned to leave, she paused for a moment, giving him a final, encouraging look. "You're doing great, Alexio," she said. "One day at a time." Alexio watched her walk back toward the mansion, the weight in his chest lighter than it had ever been. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. A new journey had begun, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The following days passed in a blur of small, yet significant, changes for Alexio. The mansion, which had once felt like a cold, oppressive space, now seemed more like a place where he could breathe. Naomi continued to guide him, offering him not just the wisdom of experience, but a quiet strength that helped him believe in his own potential. Slowly, But surely, Alexio was starting to find his footing. The power dynamics that had once been so clear in the mansion now seemed less defined, more fluid. He found himself making decisions he once would have hesitated to make. Decisions that reflected the man he was beginning to be, not the one his family expected him to become. One afternoon, as the late summer heat settled over the mansion, Alexio found himself standing in the grand hallway, staring at a large portrait of his father that hung on the wall. The portrait was a striking image of power, his father's stern face gazing down at him, frozen in time. For the first time, Alexio didn't feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him as he stared at the painting. Instead, he felt a kind of detachment, a realization that he wasn't the boy in that portrait, and he didn't need to become the man his father had hoped he would be. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. You can still be a part of your family, but you don't have to be controlled by them. He had always been afraid to disappoint his father, but now, as he stood in front of that painting, he felt the stirrings of freedom. He could still respect his father's legacy, but that didn't mean he had to follow the same path. He turned away from the painting, his heart lighter than it had been in years. It was time to take the next step. That evening, as the mansion settled into its usual rhythm of quiet luxury, Alexio sought out Naomi. He found her in the garden, as she often was when the weather allowed it, tending to the flowers and the plants with a calm that seemed to mirror the serenity he was beginning to feel. Naomi, he called out softly, and she turned, offering him a small, knowing smile. Alexio, she replied, setting down her tools. Is everything okay? He nodded, walking over to her with a sense of purpose in his step. I've been thinking, he said, his voice steady. I need to do something. I can't just keep living in this house, in this life, without making a real choice about who I want to be. Naomi's expression softened, and she nodded. What do you want to do? She asked, her voice gentle but encouraging. Alexio took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity that had eluded him for so long. I want to start making decisions that reflect who I am, not who my father wants me to be. I've been running away from it, but it's time to face it. Naomi smiled at him, her eyes filled with pride. You're ready, she said simply. And I'll be here, helping you every step of the way. The words meant more to Alexio than he could express. He had been afraid to face the truth of his own feelings, afraid of the consequences that might come with choosing his own path. But now, with Naomi's unwavering support, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Over the next few days, Alexio began to take charge of his own future in small but meaningful ways. He started meeting with business associates, people who worked for his family, but on his own terms, making decisions that aligned with his values rather than those of his father. It was a slow process, but every step felt like a victory. Naomi continued to be his steady anchor, offering her quiet wisdom whenever he needed it. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Alexio turned to Naomi, his heart full of gratitude. I don't think I could have done this without you, he said quietly. Naomi smiled, her eyes warm with affection. You've always had the strength, Alexio. You just needed someone to believe in you, to remind you that you're not alone. He nodded, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Naomi reached over and placed a hand on his, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. You're not just the son of a Mafia boss, Alexio, she said softly. You are your own person, and you always have been. Alexio looked out over the garden, the last rays of sunlight casting a golden glow over the flowers and the trees. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace that had been missing for so long. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he had the power to shape it. As he sat there with Naomi, the woman who had helped him find his way, he knew that he had begun a new chapter in his life. And whatever came next, he was ready to face it. With Naomi by his side, he felt more certain than ever that he could create a future that was his own. The weight of his family's expectations no longer felt like a chain around his neck. Instead, it felt like something he could bear, something he could choose to carry or set down when the time was right. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Alexio felt a sense of hope fill his heart. He had a long road ahead of him, but with every step, he was closer to finding the man he was meant to be. Alexio's path forward was no longer just about avoiding the mistakes of his past. It was about carving out a future that belonged to him. The mansion had once been a cage, its grand walls echoing with the oppressive weight of his father's legacy. But now, as Alexio stood in the same marble halls, he didn't feel trapped anymore. He was beginning to realize that he could choose his own direction, and he was more determined than ever to make that choice count. Naomi had been there for him every step of the way, and her steady support was something he valued deeply. But Alexio knew that there were still challenges ahead, and as much as he wanted to break free from his father's shadow, there were forces at play that would not let him go so easily. One afternoon, as Alexio reviewed a series of contracts in his study, he was interrupted by a knock at the door. He looked up to see one of his father's closest associates, Marco, entering the room. Marco was an imposing figure, a man who carried the weight of the family's operations with a kind of ruthless precision. "Boss wants to see you," Marco said, his tone matter of fact. Alexio's heart sank. It had been a while since his father had called for him, and he knew this meeting wouldn't be casual. "I'll be there soon," Alexio replied, trying to mask the unease in his voice. Marco nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Alexio stared at the stack of papers in front of him, feeling the familiar weight of his family's expectations pressing down on him again. He knew his father was watching him, waiting to see whether he would rise to the occasion or continue to stray from the path that had been laid out for him. As he walked down the grand hallway toward his father's office, Alexio couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety. The walls, adorned with priceless paintings and expensive furniture, felt cold and distant. It was a reminder of the life he had inherited, a life he had never fully embraced. When he entered his father's office, the air felt heavy with tension. His father, the Mafia boss, sat behind a large oak desk, his face hard and unreadable. Dominic Valentino was a man of few words, and when he spoke, it was always with the kind of authority that left no room for disagreement. "Sit down, Alexio," his father said, his voice deep and commanding. Alexio sat across from him, his posture stiff, trying to maintain composure. "I've been hearing things," his father continued, his gaze never leaving Alexio's face. "People are talking. They say you've been making decisions on your own, stepping outside of the family's operations. Is that true?" Alexio's heart raced. He had known this confrontation was coming, but he hadn't prepared himself for the reality of it. "I've been thinking, father," Alexio began, his voice steady but firm. "I can't keep living my life the way you want me to. I've spent so many years doing what I was told, but I'm not a child anymore. I want to make my own choices, even if that means stepping away from the business." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Alexio thought his father might erupt in anger. But instead, Dominic's expression remained unchanged, his eyes sharp as ever. "You think you can just walk away?" Dominic asked, his tone laced with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "This family, this empire, everything I've built, it's not something you can just abandon. You're my son, Alexio. You don't have the luxury of choosing your own path." Alexio clenched his fists under the table, but he didn't back down. "I respect what you've built, father," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But I can't be a part of it anymore. I can't keep pretending to be someone I'm not. I need to find my own way, even if that means leaving the business." Dominic's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Alexio thought his father might lash out. But then, to his surprise, Dominic leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I didn't raise you to be weak, Alexio," Dominic said slowly, his voice quieter now. "But if you truly believe this is what you want, then you're going to have to prove it. I won't just let you walk away. You have to show me that you're capable of standing on your own. And if you fail, you'll regret it." Alexio's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. "I'm ready to prove it, father. I'm not afraid of failing. I'm afraid of never trying." His father studied him for a moment, his gaze intense. Then, finally, Dominic nodded, as if conceding some unspoken point. "Very well," he said. "You want to leave the family business? Fine. But remember this, Alexio, you'll never truly escape it. It's in your blood, and no matter how far you go, you'll always be a part of this world. Don't forget that." Alexio stood, his resolve strengthening with each word. "I won't forget, father," he said, his voice steady. "But I will be my own person." With that, he turned and walked out of the office, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft thud. As Alexio made his way back to his room, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The conversation with his father hadn't gone the way he had hoped, but it had gone the way he needed. He was ready to take the next step, to prove that he could be his own man. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. And as he looked out over the mansion from his window, he knew that his journey was just beginning. Alexio stood at the edge of the grand mansion, looking out over the sprawling estate. The landscape before him, with its perfectly manicured lawns and towering trees, had once felt like a prison, a gilded cage that held him captive by his father's expectations. But now, standing there in the cool evening air, he felt a sense of freedom that had eluded him for years. He had made a choice, his own choice, and while it wasn't going to be easy, he was ready for whatever came next. His father had warned him that he could never truly escape the family's world, that the blood of the Mafia ran too deep. But Alexio wasn't running away. He was stepping forward, forging his own path. And it felt good. Naomi had been his rock throughout this journey, and he knew she would continue to be there for him. But as much as she had supported him, Alexio realized that he had to face the reality of his situation head-on. There were people in his life, family, friends, and enemies, who wouldn't accept his decision so easily. One of those people, he knew, was Marco. Marco had always been more than just his father's right-hand man. He had been Alexio's mentor in many ways, teaching him the ropes of the family business. But now, as Alexio prepared to distance himself from it all, he knew Marco would be one of the hardest to face. That evening, Marco came to find him. It was no surprise. Marco had always known how to track him down. "Alexio," Marco said as he approached him in the garden, his presence as imposing as always. "Your father wants to see you. There's something important we need to discuss." Alexio turned to face him, feeling the familiar unease creep up his spine. "I've already spoken to him," Alexio replied, his voice steady, but not without a hint of tension. "I'm not following in his footsteps. I'm not taking over the family business." Marco's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said after a long pause. "You really think you can just walk away from all of this?" Alexio held his ground. "It's not about walking away. It's about choosing my own path. I don't need to be trapped in a world of crime and violence to be someone. I'm done with that life." Marco studied him for a moment, his gaze intense. Alexio could feel the weight of Marco's silent judgment, but he didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake, Alexio," Marco said finally, his voice colder than before. "Your father built this empire from nothing. He's done things no one else would dare. And now you're just going to throw it all away? You don't know what you're asking for." Alexio's chest tightened, but he stood tall, refusing to back down. "I know exactly what I'm asking for, Marco," he said, his voice firm. "I'm asking for a chance to live my own life, to make my own decisions. I'm not my father. I don't want to be him." Marco stepped closer, his eyes flashing with something dark. "You think you're different? You think you can just walk away and leave this all behind?" he asked, his voice rising. "You'll never be free, Alexio. You'll always be a part of this family. You'll always be a part of this world." Alexio took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. "Maybe I will always be part of this family, Marco. But that doesn't mean I have to be a part of the business. I'm not like you. I don't want to keep living in the shadows, hiding behind violence and fear. I want something better for myself." There was a long pause, the tension between them palpable. Marco's expression softened for a moment, and for the briefest second, Alexio saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by something else, something darker. "You're making a dangerous decision, Alexio," Marco said, his voice low. "You don't understand what you're up against. You're not ready to face the consequences." Alexio met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm ready to face whatever comes my way," he said quietly. "But I'm doing it on my terms." Marco didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the garden. Alexio watched him go, his heart pounding. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Marco wasn't the only one who would stand in his way. There were others, family members, associates, rivals, who wouldn't accept his decision. But Alexio felt something inside him that he hadn't felt in years: determination. He was ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. And as he stood there in the quiet garden, looking out over the mansion that had once felt like a prison, Alexio knew that his journey was just beginning. He wasn't sure where it would take him, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally in control of his own destiny. With Naomi by his side, he felt more certain than ever that he could shape his future, that he could build a life for himself that wasn't defined by his family's empire. The mansion, the family, the business, none of it could hold him back anymore. He was free to choose his own path. And nothing, not even Marco's harsh words, could change that. The days after the confrontation with Marco were quiet, but Alexio could feel the tension building beneath the surface. His decision to step away from his father's world was not without consequences, and although his father had given him an ultimatum, Alexio knew that things would not stay calm for long. His father's warning echoed in his mind. You'll never truly escape it. But Alexio refused to be controlled by fear or the shadows of his past. He was determined to walk his own path, no matter what it cost him. Naomi continued to stand by his side, offering him the kind of support that he hadn't even known he needed. She never judged, never pushed him too hard, but always made sure he knew that he was capable of more than he believed. It was the kind of steady, quiet encouragement that Alexio needed to make the toughest decisions. One evening, as the first signs of winter began to creep into the air, Alexio found himself once again standing by the garden fountain, the same place where he had made his decision to change. The mansion was quiet now, the shadows growing longer as the evening settled in. He had come to reflect, as he often did when the weight of the world seemed too much to carry. The soft rustle of leaves underfoot was the only sound as he stood there, thinking about what came next. The decision to leave the business was final, but the road ahead remained uncertain. Alexio couldn't shake the feeling that his past would come for him sooner or later. It wasn't long before Naomi appeared beside him, her presence a comfort in the cold evening air. She stood silently for a moment, letting him gather his thoughts. You've been quiet lately, she said softly, her gaze steady and understanding. Are you all right? Alexio turned to her, meeting her gaze. I'm not sure, he admitted, his voice quiet. I've made my decision, but I can't help but wonder what's next. I feel like I've left something behind, but I don't know how to move forward without it. Naomi nodded, her expression full of empathy. It's normal to feel that way, she said gently. You've spent your whole life in this world. Of course, there will be doubts, but that doesn't mean you're making the wrong choice. It just means you're human. Alexio let out a long breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. I want to believe that, he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. But I'm afraid that no matter how far I run, the past will always catch up with me. My father, the business, it's all I've ever known. How do I just walk away from that? Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm but gentle. You don't have to walk away from everything, Alexio, she said. You're not running from who you are. You're just choosing to live differently. And that's something you deserve. Alexio looked at her, a mix of gratitude and disbelief in his eyes. You really believe that? He asked quietly. Naomi smiled, a soft, reassuring smile that spoke volumes. I do, she said simply, because I've seen the man you're becoming. And I believe in you. Her words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in days, Alexio felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had spent so much time trying to live up to the expectations of others, his father, his family, the business. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to see a future where he could be his own person, where he could make decisions for himself without fear of losing everything. As the days turned into weeks, Alexio began to find his rhythm. He made strides in building his own business, a venture that would take him far from the world of crime and power that had once defined him. Naomi was there every step of the way, offering advice and support, her belief in him never wavering. But even as he moved forward, Alexio knew that his past would never be fully behind him. There were still people who would try to pull him back into the life he was trying to leave. One day, as Alexio sat in his office, reviewing some contracts for the new business, his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was calm, but unmistakable. Alexio, the man said. It's Marco. Alexio's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. What do you want, Marco? He asked, his tone guarded. Marco's laugh on the other end was low, almost mocking. I thought you'd be easier to reach than this, he said. You've made your choice, I get it. But you should know that your father isn't happy. He doesn't take kindly to being disrespected. Alexio's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Marco provoke him. I've made my choice, Marco, he said firmly. And I'm not changing it. There was a long silence before Marco spoke again. You may think you've got control, Alexio, but you've made a mistake. You can't leave this life without consequences. No one just walks away from the family. Alexio's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve only hardened. I'm not walking away from the family, he said. I'm just walking away from the business. Marco's voice dropped lower, a dangerous edge creeping into his words. We'll see how long that lasts, he said before hanging up. Alexio stared at the phone for a moment, his heart racing. He had known that stepping away from his family's world wouldn't be easy, but the conversation with Marco had made it clear his past would never let him go without a fight. But as he looked out the window at the life he was building, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to face whatever came next. He wasn't alone, and with Naomi by his side, he knew he had the strength to build a future of his own. The days following his conversation with Marco were filled with tension, but Alexio remained resolute in his decision. He had built a life outside the family business, one that was finally beginning to take shape in ways he never thought possible. He had poured his energy into his new venture, surrounding himself with people who believed in him, not because of his name or his bloodline, but because of who he was becoming. Naomi was by his side through it all, her steady presence a constant reminder that he was on the right path. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He had known from the moment he made his decision that it wouldn't come without challenges, but as the days wore on, he could feel the weight of those challenges becoming heavier. One evening, as Alexio sat in his office, working late into the night, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number. It was Marco again. His heart sank. He knew this call wouldn't bring good news. He hesitated for a moment before answering. What do you want, Marco? Alexio's voice was tight, but he tried to keep his tone steady. Marco's voice came through the phone with a hint of amusement, as though he knew exactly how much this call would unsettle Alexio. I'm surprised you've been able to hide from us for so long, Alexio, Marco said, his voice low and calm. But I guess it was only a matter of time before you realized you can't escape what's in your blood. Alexio clenched his jaw, but he didn't let his frustration show. I'm not hiding, Marco, he said firmly. I'm just making my own choices now. That's not the same as running. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Marco spoke again, his tone was more serious. You think you're free? You think you can just walk away from everything without consequences? Marco's words hit Alexio like a punch to the gut. He knew what Marco was saying was true. He couldn't just erase the life he had been born into, no matter how hard he tried. I've made my choice, Marco, Alexio said, his voice firm, but there was an underlying edge to it. And I'm not going back. I don't care what my father or anyone else thinks. Marco's laugh on the other end of the phone was cold. You're still so naive, Alexio, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. You think you can walk away from the family without us noticing? Without us doing something about it? Alexio's grip tightened on the phone, but he refused to let Marco's words shake him. I don't need your approval, Marco, he said, his voice unwavering. I'm not interested in your threats. I've made my decision, and I'll stand by it. There was a moment of silence, and for a brief second, Alexio wondered if Marco was going to hang up. But instead, Marco spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost contemplative. You don't understand what you're getting into, Alexio, Marco said, his tone colder now. You think you can walk away from the family, but the family doesn't let go. And you're not going to like the consequences when they come. Alexio's heart raced, but he refused to back down. I'm not afraid of consequences, he said, his voice steady. I'm ready to face whatever comes my way, but I'm doing it on my own terms. Marco didn't respond right away. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Marco's voice came through again, more ominous this time. We'll see, Alexio. We'll see if you can really stand on your own. The line went dead, and Alexio lowered the phone from his ear, staring at it for a long moment. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he felt something else, a kind of clarity, a determination that had been growing inside him ever since he made his decision. He wasn't going to let anyone drag him back into a life he didn't want. He was ready for whatever came next. That night, as Alexio lay in bed, the weight of the conversation with Marco hung over him. He knew it wasn't over, that his decision to break away from the family would have consequences. But for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of peace in the midst of the storm. He wasn't alone in this. Naomi had been there for him every step of the way, and he knew she would continue to support him. As he drifted off to sleep, he found himself thinking about the future, his future. A future where he made the rules, where he could create something of his own. And for the first time in years, Alexio felt hopeful. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He had taken control of his life, and no one, not even Marco, could take that away from him. The next morning, he woke with a new sense of purpose. He had no idea what the future held, but he was ready to take the next step, whatever it might be. Naomi was waiting for him in the garden, as always, and when he saw her, he felt a surge of gratitude. He had made it this far, and with her by his side, he knew he could go even further. The days that followed Marco's warning were filled with a quiet kind of tension that Alexio couldn't quite shake off. He had made his decision, and he knew the path he had chosen was one that wouldn't be free of obstacles. But with every passing day, his resolve grew stronger. He could feel the weight of his father's empire still looming over him. But instead of pulling him back, it seemed to push him forward, making him more determined to prove that he could stand on his own. Naomi, as always, was his steady anchor. She had been there for him from the beginning, offering support without judgment, and now more than ever, he needed her presence. She had been a quiet but constant reminder of the possibility of a different life, one where he could make his own choices and live by his own values. One afternoon, as Alexio was reviewing documents in his office, he received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was his father. Alexio, his father's voice came through, deep and authoritative as always. "I want to see you." Alexio's stomach tightened at the sound of his father's voice. He had been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since his conversation with Marco. His father had been silent for a while, but Alexio knew the time had come for the next confrontation. "I'll be there," Alexio replied, his voice steady despite the unease rising inside him. The drive to his father's mansion was a quiet one, the familiar streets and buildings passing by without much thought. But as he neared the gates of the estate, a sense of finality washed over him. This was it. He was about to face the man who had shaped his entire life, for better or worse. When Alexio entered the mansion, he was immediately met by two of his father's men. Without a word, they led him down the long corridors to the private study where Dominic Valentino spent most of his time. The room was exactly as it had always been, dark, imposing, and cold. But there was something different about it today, something heavy in the air that made Alexio's heart race. His father was sitting at his usual desk, looking over papers, as if nothing had changed. But the moment Alexio stepped into the room, his father looked up, and the tension between them was palpable. "Sit down, Alexio," Dominic commanded, his voice firm. Alexio did as instructed, sitting across from his father. There was a long silence, broken only by the rustle of papers on the desk. Finally, Dominic spoke. "I've been hearing a lot about you, son. People are talking. You've made quite a stir with your decisions. People are starting to wonder if you've lost your mind." Alexio met his father's gaze, refusing to look away. "I haven't lost my mind, father. I'm just making my own choices now." Dominic's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just walk away from everything? You think you can leave the family business and live a normal life?" Alexio's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not leaving the family, father. I'm just not going to be a part of the business anymore. I've made my decision." There was a long pause as his father considered his words. Finally, Dominic leaned forward, his hands steepled in front of him. "You think you can just walk away from this life without consequences?" he asked quietly. Alexio didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of consequences. I've already accepted that they'll come. But I'm not going to live my life under your shadow anymore." Dominic's face darkened, his expression hardening into something unreadable. "You think this is about shadows, Alexio? This is about loyalty. This is about blood. You don't just abandon the family. You don't just turn your back on everything I've built. You can't escape this, no matter how hard you try." Alexio swallowed, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing his father say it out loud made it feel more real. "I'm not trying to escape, father," Alexio said, his voice softer now, but still firm. "I'm just trying to live my own life. I don't want to keep living for someone else's dream." Dominic's gaze was cold, his jaw clenched. "Then you'll learn the hard way, Alexio. You'll see that the world doesn't let you go that easily. You'll see that you can't run from this family. Not now, not ever." Alexio held his father's gaze, feeling the weight of his words, but he didn't back down. I'm not running, father. I'm choosing my own path. And that's something I'm willing to fight for. There was another long pause, and for a moment, Alexio wondered if his father would say anything more. But instead, Dominic leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into something like resignation. You're making a mistake, Alexio, he said quietly. But if this is what you want, then I won't stop you. Alexio felt a rush of relief, though it was quickly tempered by the coldness in his father's tone. I won't stop you, Dominic repeated, his voice colder now. But don't think for 1 second that this will be easy. You've made your choice, and now you'll have to live with the consequences. As Alexio stood to leave, his heart was pounding. He had expected his father to be angry, to try and force him back into the business, but this was different. It was a cold, calculated dismissal, one that made Alexio realize just how far apart they had grown. When he stepped out of the study, he felt a sense of finality settle in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he could finally break free. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he was certain of one thing. He was ready to face whatever came his way. With Naomi by his side, he knew he had the strength to build a life of his own, one that didn't depend on the power or influence of his family. He was free, and for the first time in his life, Alexio felt the weight of his father's empire lift off his shoulders. The days after his conversation with his father felt surreal for Alexio. He had expected anger, resentment, and perhaps even a confrontation, but what he had received instead was a cold, calculated dismissal. It was as if Dominic had resigned himself to the fact that Alexio was slipping away from him. But in that moment, as Alexio walked out of the study and into the quiet of the mansion's grand halls, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his father's empire lifting from his shoulders. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he could truly begin to build his own life. Naomi had been his anchor through all of this, and as he made his way to find her, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for her presence in his life. He found her outside, sitting by the garden, the evening sun casting a golden hue over everything. When she saw him, she smiled, but there was a question in her eyes. She could sense that something had changed. Alexio stood in front of her, his heart still racing from the conversation he had just had with his father. Naomi, he said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of emotion, I did it. I told him. I'm not going back. I'm done with the business. Naomi stood up, her eyes searching his face. She could see the tension in his posture, but there was also something else, something that had shifted in him. And how do you feel? She asked softly, stepping closer to him. Alexio's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel vulnerable. I feel free, he said quietly, but also scared. I don't know what comes next. I've spent so much time running from this life, from what was expected of me, but now that I'm not running anymore, I'm not sure where to go. Naomi placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. It's okay to be scared, she said gently, but you've made the hardest decision. You're choosing to live your own life, and that's something worth celebrating. Whatever happens next, you won't be alone. Alexio's chest tightened at her words. He had never felt so understood, so seen. I don't know what the future holds, Naomi, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I know one thing. I'm not going back to that life. I'm not going to be my father's shadow anymore. Naomi smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. I believe in you, Alexio. You've already made the hardest part. The rest will fall into place. Over the next few days, Alexio threw himself into his new venture with a kind of quiet determination. He had known that leaving behind the family business would be difficult, but the freedom he felt now was more exhilarating than he had imagined. Each day brought new challenges, new lessons, but with Naomi by his side, he felt more capable than ever of navigating the complexities of the life he was building. But the shadow of his father's empire wasn't entirely gone. One afternoon, as Alexio was meeting with his new business partners, he received an unexpected visit. The man at the door was a stranger, but his presence was unmistakable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of authority that reminded Alexio all too much of the men who worked for his father. Mr. Valentino, the man asked, his voice cold and professional. I'm here on behalf of your father. He'd like to have a word with you. Alexio's stomach dropped. He had known this moment was coming, but it still caught him off guard. I'm not going back to the family business, Alexio said, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. The man nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. This isn't about the business, he said. Your father wants to speak with you. It's important. Alexio hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse, to continue with the life he had begun to build, but another part of him knew that he couldn't keep running from his past. He looked at Naomi, who was standing nearby, her eyes filled with quiet concern. She gave him a nod, a small but reassuring gesture, and Alexio knew what he had to do. Fine, he said, his voice steady. I'll come, but I'm not changing my mind. The man didn't say anything else as he led Alexio to the waiting car outside. The drive was tense, the city passing by in a blur as Alexio's thoughts raced. He had made his choice, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting with his father would be the moment that determined everything. When they arrived at the estate, Alexio was led through the familiar halls, the same ones he had walked through for years, but this time they felt different. He wasn't the same person who had entered those doors all those years ago. He had made his decision, and no one, not even his father, could take that from him. As he entered his father's study, he was met with the familiar, imposing figure of Dominic Valentino. His father's eyes were cold, but there was something else in them, something that Alexio hadn't seen in a long time, a flicker of concern. Sit down, Dominic said, his voice low and commanding. Alexio did as instructed, his mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. I've been hearing about your new venture, Dominic said, his voice even. I'll admit, I didn't expect you to walk away, but I see now that you're serious. Alexio didn't speak, his gaze steady as he met his father's eyes. What do you want, father? He asked, his voice calm but firm. Dominic leaned forward, his hands clasped together in front of him. I want you to understand something, Alexio, he said, his tone shifting. You can't just turn your back on this family. You'll always be a part of it. And if you think you can live without us, you're wrong. Alexio swallowed, but he didn't look away. I'm not turning my back on the family, he said, his voice unwavering. I'm just choosing my own way. The conversation with his father had ended in silence, a silence that hung between them like a heavy fog. Dominic's words had been sharp, filled with the unspoken threat of consequences, but Alexio stood firm in his decision. He was no longer the son who would bend to his father's will, no longer the heir to a world built on power and fear. He had made his choice, and he wasn't turning back. As he left his father's study, he felt a sense of finality settle in his chest. The weight of his family's legacy still loomed over him, but it no longer had the power to control him. He had taken back his life, and no one, least of all his father, could take that from him. The journey ahead would be difficult, but it was his journey to make. The mansion felt colder now, the grand halls and luxurious rooms that once felt like home, now, just reminders of a life he no longer wanted. Alexio walked through the hallways, his thoughts racing. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had the strength to face it. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. Naomi had always been there, supporting him, believing in him when he hadn't believed in himself. And now, more than ever, he realized just how much she meant to him. He found her in the garden, as she often was, the moonlight casting a soft glow over her. She turned as she heard his footsteps, her expression softening when she saw the look on his face. How did it go? She asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. Alexio stopped in front of her, his heart pounding in his chest. It went, as expected, he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of finality. I told him I'm not going back. I'm not a part of the family business anymore. Naomi nodded, her eyes searching his face. And how do you feel? She asked. Relieved, he replied, his voice full of conviction, but also scared. I'm free, Naomi, but there's so much uncertainty ahead. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. That's okay, she said softly. It's okay to be scared, but you're doing what you need to do. You're choosing your own life, and that's the most important thing. Alexio met her gaze, feeling a surge of emotion. I don't know if I can ever fully escape it, he admitted, his voice thick with vulnerability. The family, the business, it's in my blood. It's hard to shake that off. Naomi's expression softened, and she stepped closer to him. You don't need to shake it off, Alexio, she said gently. It's a part of who you are, but it doesn't define you. You're more than just the family you were born into. You're someone who can choose a different path. He looked at her, a sense of gratitude flooding his chest. She was the one person who understood, the one person who had always believed in him. I don't know if I can do this without you, he said quietly. Naomi smiled, her eyes warm. You've always had the strength inside you, Alexio. You just needed to believe in it. And I'll always be here to help you along the way. The words filled him with a sense of peace, and for the first time in a long while, Alexio felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't alone in this. Together, they would face whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, Alexio threw himself into his new business. He had chosen a path of his own, a path that didn't involve the Mafia or the world of crime that had once defined his family. It was difficult at times, but with Naomi's guidance, he found a sense of purpose he had never known. As he stood at the head of his new company, making decisions for the first time in his life on his own terms, Alexio couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had done it. He had taken control of his life, and with Naomi by his side, he was ready to build something lasting. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Alexio was no longer afraid. He knew he had the strength to face whatever challenges came his way. His father's empire was a thing of the past, and Alexio was free to create his own future. And as he looked over the city from the balcony of his new office, he knew that this was only the beginning. The journey was long, but it was his journey to make. With Naomi by his side, Alexio finally felt like he was walking toward the future he had always dreamed of. A future where he was in control, where he was no longer defined by his family's legacy, but by his own choices. He wasn't running anymore. He was living. And for the first time in his life, Alexio knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Experience a captivating tale of transformation and self-discovery in this gripping journey through the world of romance stories. Follow Alexio as he breaks free from the constraints of his family's Mafia empire to forge a life of his own, guided by the unwavering support of Naomi. This emotional journey explores the complexities of love, personal growth, and the courage to make bold choices, all set against the backdrop of a powerful family legacy. As Alexio navigates the challenges of leaving behind a world built on power and fear, he learns that true freedom comes with both sacrifices and rewards. Through it all, Naomi's presence in his life offers the strength. He needs to fight for a future where he is the master of his own destiny. With themes of redemption, self-determination, and unconditional support, this narrative perfectly aligns with the best romance stories that resonate deeply with those seeking stories of inner strength and love. Alexio's journey is one of discovery, as he learns to balance his past with his future while facing challenges from his family, friends, and the expectations of his legacy. For fans of powerful romance stories that touch the heart and inspire change, this is a tale you won't want to miss. The evolution of Alexio's character, supported by the constant encouragement from Naomi, shows that even in the most challenging times, love and perseverance lead the way. Get lost in the world of romance stories, where every moment is filled with emotional depth and every choice can shape the future. Dive into this incredible narrative and discover how Alexio's journey is more than just about escaping his past, but also about embracing a love that frees him to become the man he was always meant to be.